In August of 2018, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado became the center of one of the most shocking family murder cases in modern American history. The case would later be known around the world as the Chris Watts family murders. At first, it looked like a missing persons case. A pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters had suddenly disappeared. Their husband and father appeared on television begging for their safe return. But within just a few days, investigators would discover a horrifying truth. The man pleading for help was the same man responsible for their deaths. The story begins with a couple who, to many people, seemed to have the perfect life. Chris Watts and his wife Shanann Watts lived in a large house in a quiet neighborhood. Their home stood on a clean suburban street, surrounded by similar houses and families. Chris worked as an operator for an oil company. Shanann worked in sales and often shared parts of her life on social media. The couple had 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Shanann was also 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child. From the outside, their life appeared happy. Family photos showed smiling faces. Videos posted online showed Shanann playing with her daughters and talking excitedly about their growing family. Friends described Shanann as energetic and outgoing. Chris, on the other hand, was known as quiet and reserved. But nothing about their public image suggested the nightmare that was about to unfold. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip. She had flown back to Colorado late at night after attending a work event in Arizona. A friend dropped her off at the house around 2 o'clock in the morning. At that time, everything appeared normal. But by the afternoon, something strange began to happen. Shanann missed an important doctor's appointment. Her phone stopped responding. Her friends began to worry. One of Shanann's close friends, Nicole Atkinson, became especially concerned. Shanann had been communicating with her constantly during the business trip. Now suddenly there was silence. Nicole decided to check on her. She drove to the Watts family home and knocked on the door. No one answered. She noticed Shanann's car was still parked in the garage, but Shanann herself was nowhere to be seen. Nicole immediately felt that something was wrong. She contacted Chris Watts and asked where Shanann was. Chris responded calmly. He said Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house. But Nicole was not convinced. She knew Shanann would never disappear without contacting someone. After waiting outside the house for some time, Nicole called the police. When officers arrived, Chris returned home shortly after. At first, he appeared cooperative. He allowed officers to enter the house and look around. Inside, investigators noticed something unusual. Shanann's purse was still inside the house. Her phone was still there too. These were items she normally carried everywhere. If she had left voluntarily, it made little sense that she would leave them behind. Chris continued repeating the same explanation. He claimed Shanann had taken the girls somewhere after they had an emotional conversation about their relationship. He said he did not know where they went. But the situation quickly became suspicious. Police asked Chris if they could review security footage from a neighbor's camera. The neighbor, a man named Nate, had a camera pointing toward the Watts family driveway. Chris agreed. Inside the neighbor's house, they watched the footage together. The video showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning. He appeared to be loading items into the truck before leaving for work. As the footage played, something strange happened. Chris became visibly nervous. He began talking rapidly, explaining things that no one had asked about. The neighbor noticed Chris's unusual behavior immediately. At one point, Nate later said Chris was acting like he knew something bad had happened. Still, there was no direct evidence yet. Later that same day, Chris Watts appeared on local television. Standing outside his home, he gave an interview asking for help finding his family. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. "If someone has her, please bring her back," he said. "I just want them home." But to many people watching the interview, something felt strange. Chris did not appear emotional. He did not appear panicked. Some viewers later described his behavior as unsettling. Within hours, social media users began analyzing the interview. People commented on his body language, his facial expressions, the way he spoke about his missing daughters. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the case. Inside the house, there were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no forced entry. But certain details continued raising suspicion. Shanann's medications were still inside the home. Her phone had been left behind. Her car was still in the garage. And most importantly, there was no evidence that Shanann or the girls had left the house alive. As the investigation continued, detectives also began examining Chris Watts' personal life. They discovered something important. Chris had been having an affair. He had recently started a relationship with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. Phone records showed the two had been communicating frequently. In fact, during the weeks leading up to the disappearance, Chris had spent many nights talking to her, sometimes for hours. Investigators soon realized something troubling. Chris had been living a double life. To his wife and family, he appeared to be a devoted husband and father. But secretly, he had been planning a new future with another woman. As detectives looked deeper, they found more concerning evidence. Chris had searched online for information about divorce. He had also looked up expensive vacations with Nicole. Meanwhile, Shanann had been texting friends about problems in her marriage. She told them Chris had been acting distant, cold, different. She was worried their relationship might be falling apart. But no one could have imagined what was really happening. By August 15th, investigators had gathered enough evidence to bring Chris Watts in for questioning. At the police station, detectives began asking him direct questions. At first, Chris continued repeating the same story. Shanann had taken the girls. He did not know where they were. But detectives had one more step planned. They asked Chris to take a polygraph test, a lie detector test. Chris agreed, but the results would change everything. Because when the test was finished, the examiner looked directly at him and said something that would soon become famous in the investigation. "Chris, you did not pass the test." In that moment, the story of a missing family began transforming into something far darker. And investigators were about to uncover a truth so disturbing that it would shock the entire world. After Chris Watts failed the polygraph test, the atmosphere inside the interrogation room changed completely. Up until that moment, Chris had continued repeating the same story. He insisted that Shanann had taken the girls somewhere after a difficult conversation about their relationship. He claimed he had simply gone to work like any normal morning. But the investigators sitting across from him no longer believed that version of events. The polygraph examiner had already told him clearly. He had failed the test. Now the detectives began pressing him harder. They explained that the evidence was beginning to point directly at him. They reminded him that he had been the last person to see his wife and daughters alive. They pointed out the strange details inside the house. Shanann's phone, her purse, her medication, all left behind. None of it made sense if she had simply left the house. Chris tried to remain calm, but the pressure in the room was building. Detectives used a common interrogation strategy. They suggested that perhaps something emotional had happened. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe things had gotten out of control. They gave Chris an opportunity to tell a different story. And slowly, the version of events he had been repeating began to change. Eventually, Chris said something shocking. He claimed that Shanann had killed the girls. According to his new story, he said he had discovered Shanann strangling their daughters in a moment of rage. He told detectives that when he saw this happening, he lost control. In anger, he said he strangled Shanann. For a moment, the room went quiet. The confession sounded dramatic. But the detectives were not convinced. The story did not match the evidence. And they suspected that Chris was trying to shift the blame away from himself. Still, the admission that he had killed Shanann was enough for investigators to act. Chris Watts was arrested and charged with murder. But the most disturbing part of the case was still about to be revealed. Soon after his arrest, Chris agreed to lead investigators to the location where he had taken the bodies. The site was a remote oil field operated by the company where Chris worked. The location was far from the quiet suburban neighborhood where the Watts family had lived. It was isolated, empty, a place where very few people would ever pass by. When investigators arrived at the location, they discovered something horrifying. Shanann Watts had been buried in a shallow grave nearby. But Bella and Celeste were not buried. Instead, their bodies had been placed inside two large oil tanks. The tanks were part of the oil facility where Chris worked. Each tank was filled with crude oil. Investigators later said that recovering the bodies was extremely difficult and traumatic. The discovery shocked everyone involved in the case. The man who had appeared on television begging for his family's safe return had hidden their bodies in one of the most disturbing ways imaginable. As detectives continued questioning Chris, the truth slowly began to emerge. The story he had told earlier about Shanann killing the girls was false. Eventually, Chris admitted that he had murdered all three of them himself. The events of that night were horrifying. According to Chris's later confession, Shanann returned home around 2 in the morning after her business trip. At some point during the early morning hours, the two of them began arguing about their marriage. Shanann had suspected that Chris was having an affair. During the argument, Chris strangled her. He later said that he had climbed on top of her and pressed his hands around her neck. The attack lasted several minutes. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant at the time. After killing her, Chris wrapped her body in a blanket. But the nightmare did not end there. Chris then turned his attention to his daughters. Bella and Celeste had been sleeping in their rooms. He carried them into his truck along with Shanann's body. Then he drove nearly 45 minutes to the remote oil field where he worked. Investigators later said that the drive must have been one of the most disturbing journeys imaginable. Inside the truck were 3 children, 2 still alive, and the body of their mother. At the oil site, Chris carried out the final steps of his crime. He buried Shanann in the shallow grave. Then he killed his daughters one by one. The details of Bella's final moments were especially heartbreaking. According to Chris's confession, Bella had asked him a question shortly before her death. "Daddy, are you going to do the same thing to me as you did to Cece?" Those words would later become one of the most chilling details of the entire case. After the murders, Chris placed the girls' bodies into the oil tanks. He then returned home and attempted to act as though nothing had happened. Later that day, he even appeared on television asking the public for help finding his missing family. For investigators, the case revealed a disturbing level of deception. Chris Watts had not only murdered his family. He had attempted to manipulate the public into believing he was an innocent husband searching for his wife and children. But the evidence was overwhelming. The security camera footage, his phone records, the location of the bodies, and eventually his own confession. Within days, the entire truth of the crime had become clear. The quiet suburban father had committed one of the most shocking family murders in recent American history. But even after the confession, one question continued to haunt investigators and the public. Why would a man murder his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters? The answer would soon reveal something even darker about the life Chris Watts had been secretly living. After Chris Watts confessed to the murders of his wife Shanann and their 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, the case quickly moved toward the legal system. But even though Chris had admitted what he had done, the story was far from over. Investigators, prosecutors, and the public all wanted to understand the same question. Why would a man who appeared to have a normal life suddenly destroy his entire family? As detectives continued examining the evidence, a clearer picture of Chris Watts' life began to emerge. In the months leading up to the murders, Chris had been living a secret double life. While Shanann was posting happy family videos on social media, Chris had already started emotionally distancing himself from his marriage. Friends and family later said that Shanann had begun noticing changes in his behavior. He seemed quiet, cold, different from the man she had married. What Shanann did not fully know at the time was that Chris had begun a serious relationship with another woman. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. Nicole was a co-worker at the oil company where Chris worked. The two had met earlier in 2018 and quickly developed a romantic relationship. At first, Chris told Nicole that he was in the process of separating from his wife. He claimed that his marriage was already ending. Nicole later said that she believed him. She thought he was a man who was nearly divorced and preparing to start a new chapter in his life. But the truth was far more complicated. While Chris was spending time with Nicole, Shanann was still trying to repair their marriage. Text messages later revealed that Shanann had been deeply worried about their relationship. She had told friends that Chris had become distant and emotionally withdrawn. She wanted to fix things. She believed their family could still be saved. But Chris had already begun imagining a completely different future. A future without Shanann. A future without the responsibilities of being a husband and father. Investigators later discovered that during the weeks before the murders, Chris had searched online for information about divorce. He had also searched for vacation spots he could visit with Nicole. At one point, he even searched online for the cost of an engagement ring. These searches revealed something chilling. Chris was planning a new life. But instead of ending his marriage through divorce, he made a far darker decision. When the case moved into court, prosecutors quickly built a powerful case against him. The evidence was overwhelming. Chris's own confession, the location of the bodies, security footage showing him loading items into his truck early that morning, phone records showing his movements, and the testimony of investigators who had recovered the victims at the oil site. Facing this mountain of evidence, Chris Watts made a decision. He chose to plead guilty. In November 2018, he appeared in court and admitted responsibility for the murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and his unborn son. The unborn baby had already been given a name. Shanann had planned to name him Nico. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the victims' families spoke about their loss. Shanann's parents described their daughter as loving, determined, and deeply devoted to her children. Bella and Celeste were remembered as joyful, playful girls who had bright futures ahead of them. During the sentencing hearing, Shanann's father spoke directly to Chris. His voice was filled with pain but also strength. He told Chris that despite everything, he chose not to hate him. Instead, he said he would focus on remembering the love he had for his daughter and grandchildren. The judge ultimately sentenced Chris Watts to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The case might have ended there. But in early 2019, investigators conducted another interview with Chris inside the prison where he was being held. During that interview, Chris provided additional details about the murders. Some of the information he shared made the case even more disturbing. Chris explained that on the night before the murders, he had already been thinking about killing his family. He admitted that the crime was not simply the result of an argument. It had been something he considered in advance. He also described the moment when Shanann returned home from her business trip in the early morning hours. The two had a conversation about their failing marriage. Shanann confronted him about his behavior and asked if he was seeing someone else. At some point during the conversation, Chris climbed on top of her and began strangling her. He later said that Shanann did not fight back as much as he expected. When the attack was over, he knew that he had crossed a point of no return. From that moment forward, his life would never be the same. He then described how he carried out the rest of the crime, driving to the oil site, burying Shanann in the shallow grave, and placing the bodies of Bella and Celeste into the oil tanks. During the interview, Chris admitted something that shocked even the investigators. He said that Bella had watched part of what happened, and in her final moments, she had asked him the heartbreaking question that would stay with investigators forever. "Daddy, are you going to do the same thing to me as you did to Cece?" For many people who later learned about the case, that sentence became the most chilling detail of all. It showed the unimaginable fear that child must have felt in her final moments. Today, Chris Watts is serving his life sentence in a high-security prison in Wisconsin. He spends his days isolated from the outside world. The quiet suburban life he once lived is gone forever. Meanwhile, the memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico continues to live on through their families and the people who loved them. The case of Chris Watts shocked the world because it revealed something deeply unsettling. From the outside, the Watts family appeared ordinary. A husband, a wife, 2 young daughters, a baby on the way. Nothing about their life suggested the tragedy that was coming. But behind closed doors, secrets were growing. Emotional distance, hidden relationships, and a man who chose the most unimaginable solution to escape the life he no longer wanted. The Chris Watts case remains one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern history, not only because of the crime itself, but because it reminds us of a difficult truth. Sometimes the most dangerous person is not a stranger. Sometimes the danger comes from someone who appears completely normal. A neighbor, a coworker, a husband, a father. And in this case, the man who was supposed to protect his family became the one who destroyed it forever.